All right. I have endeavored to refine the timeline a bit from the one that we've had, and I'm still not entirely content with it. I'm not sure if I want to try to spread it over 2 pages or try to keep it 1 page before I start printing it. I'm curious to see if what everybody's thoughts are on that. I could just make it 2 pages, spread it out, that way it's nice and big. But either way, so pretty much everything that was on the other timeline has been put on here, as well as some additional things and some adjustments that have been made. So on this left-hand side are just major events in the Bible. The right-hand side of the timeline I specifically gave to the writings of the New Testament, or the epistles mainly. So the things that I've added would be John the Baptist being beheaded, added James the son of Zebedee beheaded in 45 AD. Then we added Paul's imprisonments in Rome in 60 to 62. And again, depending on which commentaries or what history book or whatever you're looking at, some of these dates may be plus or minus 1 or 2 years, because we don't have exact necessarily dates for these things. But this is kind of the general range that we're talking. 64 to 66. Paul's second imprisonment in Rome, ending in his death, as well as Peter's in 66. And then from 66 to 73, I told you we were going to talk about this today, talking about what's known as the Great Revolt by the Jews. History records it as the Jewish-Roman War, or the First Jewish-Roman War. Some dates have it 66 to 70 because some people consider the war having been over as of the destruction of Jerusalem. The site that I looked at included 73 AD because that also includes the destruction of Masada, Fort Masada, which was the last holdout of the rebels. So that's why it's 66 to 73. And then, of course, in 100 AD, John, the last apostle, dies. Okay, so taking a look at this timeline, is there anything that anyone would like to have added before I print them and all that paper's used? Is there anything that anybody thinks should be added to this or done to it before I make it available to everybody? And again, I can send this electronically as well if anybody wants it.
Appreciate that. It's much more clear to distinguish.
Right. Yeah, I was trying to make it a little bit easier to read, and I may go ahead and spread it over 2 pages and maybe have the first page be 0 to 50 and then the second page 50 to 100 or 51 to 100. That way it's a little bit more spread out, because I had to kind of make the font a little smaller to fit all the epistles in here. So I might do that, and so hopefully by Wednesday maybe we'll have the timelines out on the table for everybody. Okay, so next thing that we wanted to cover is the apostles. So, first of all, I apologize for getting some of my apostles mixed up last week. I did start singing the song to myself, so I think I've got them down now. But I will say this, not to excuse it, but Philip, for whatever reason, when I read that about Philip, my mind immediately went to Philip the evangelist, not Philip the apostle. So that was, I don't know why, I just didn't think about Philip and Bartholomew, but for whatever reason. Then the other James that we talked about. So I want to talk about James for a minute, because there are technically 3 Jameses that are mentioned in the New Testament. There is James the Less, James the son of Alphaeus, and James the Lord's brother. Those are at least the 3 that are specifically mentioned. However, we know that James, the son of Zebedee, was killed by Herod in Acts chapter 12. If we presume that the James mentioned Acts chapter 12, for instance, in Acts chapter 15, the one who stood up among the apostles and elders in Jerusalem, and the one that wrote the epistle of James, if we assume that James is the Lord's brother, I have some thoughts on this. In Mark chapter 15 and in verse 40, James the Less is mentioned in context of these individuals who are mentioned as apostles. In fact, you know what? Before we get to that, Mark 15, verse 40. So we see, all right, so in this particular case, this is after Jesus is being crucified. There were some women that were looking from afar off. Mary Magdalene is mentioned, Salome is mentioned, and then Mary, the mother of James the Less and of Joseph. And I propose that this is the mother of Jesus that is being mentioned, because we know that the Lord's brothers in Matthew chapter 13 and verse 55 included Joseph, Simon, and another Judas, not Iscariot, a different Judas. But these, Joseph, Simon, and Judas, were his three brothers. Okay, so if the fact that Mary is mentioned here as being the mother of James the Less and of Joseph, I propose that this is the Lord's mother, and that James the Less would therefore be the brother of Jesus. So, if that's the case, and again, I'm offering this as thoughts, if James the Lord's brother was an apostle, he would be the same James as the son of Alphaeus. And my reasoning on that is, remember, we don't see any evidence of Joseph mentioned anywhere after Jesus is about 13 years old. Okay, it is possible that Joseph, and it's considered probable by many commentaries, that Joseph did die at some point. And then possibly Mary might have remarried a man named Alphaeus, had more children with him. Alphaeus then died, which may have been why John was given to Mary to take care of as Jesus was on the cross, as John is telling Jesus, as Jesus is telling John to take care of his mother. So that it's possible that perhaps Alphaeus was also dead. But it's interesting because in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and in verse 7, we have mention of a couple of these fellows. But notice how Paul, it's not necessarily definitive here, but in verse 7, after that he was seen by James, then by all the apostles. Last of all, he was seen by me also as one born out of due time. Depending on how you read that in verse 7, was he including James as a group of the apostles, as in then by all the rest of the apostles? It's interesting because when you compare this with Galatians chapter 1 and in verse 19, notice what Paul says about James here. Galatians 1 and in verse 19, verse 18, after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to see Peter, remained with him 15 days, but I saw none of the other apostles except for James, the Lord's brother. So I would propose that the same James, which is James the Less, the Lord's brother, and is also mentioned in the grouping of apostles as being James, the son of Alphaeus, they're all the same person. Because there aren't three Jameses mentioned in the group of apostles that Jesus called. There are only two Jameses mentioned. One was the son of Zebedee. He has died in Acts chapter 12. The other, based on what Paul says here in verse 19, as well as 1 Corinthians 15, very likely is the Lord's brother, who is also an apostle. So, that being the case, Acts chapter 1 and in verse 13, after Judas Iscariot has died and they've come back together to appoint for God to appoint a new apostle, verse 13, when they had entered, they went into the upper room where they were staying. Peter, James, John, and Andrew, this would be James, the son of Zebedee, John, Andrew, Philip, Thomas, Bartholomew, Matthew, James, the son of Alphaeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas. The New King James, I don't know why it has this, Judas, the son of James. That's not in the Greek. In fact, the King James has the brother of James. But it's interesting to me that Judas, the other Judas, is never considered to be the son of James. I don't know why the New King James includes that italicized part there. But like I said, the King James has the brother of James, which I think is interesting. So here's all of the apostles who have gathered in verse 13 in the upper room in Acts chapter 1. So James, the son of Alphaeus, he's of these apostles that were among them. This is the only James other than James the son of Zebedee that is among them. So I offer that as food for thought, that perhaps there were really only two Jameses. There was the James the son of Zebedee, but then James the Less, who was also James the son of Alphaeus, who was also the Lord's brother. That's just a thought that I had. Also, Jude. In Jude chapter 1, verse 1, Jude refers to himself as being the brother of James. Well, there's never a Jude mentioned as being associated with the sons of Zebedee. It was just James and John. So unless this is a third Jude, which is possible, it is also possible that Jude is the brother of James, who is also the brother of Jesus. So, and remember, Judas was mentioned as being a brother of Jesus, Joseph, Simon, and Judas in Matthew chapter 13, verse 55. And I did read one commentary that kind of threw some of this out there, but said John chapter 7, verse 5 refutes all that his brothers didn't believe. And my suggestion is that those brothers who were there with Mary may have only been Joseph and Simon. Okay, the other two brothers of Jesus may not have included James and Judas, as at least as of John chapter 7, it would appear that all the apostles had already been called at that point. So, again, food for thought. Any thoughts on the Jameses? Sorry, a lot of information.
Back at that time, what is the reference to the less? What was the...
I have no idea. It's only referenced that one time, James the Less in Mark chapter 15, verse 40. All the other times, it's James the son of Alphaeus. Unless Alphaeus, because we have an example of Simon who is known as Simon the Canaanite, or also Simon the Zealot. And there's one of the references that I read about this is that the possible reason why he's referred to as both is that Canaanite, the root form of that means zeal. And so it's possible that Alphaeus, the root form of Alphaeus, may have meant in some form less. That's the only thing I can figure, because I don't think it would have been appropriate to say James, the lesser of the brothers, because Jesus was the greater. I don't think that would be the case. But James the Less, I have not read anything regarding what that less may be referenced to. The scriptures don't specify. Yes, ma'am.
In Mark, the English Standard says the younger.
The younger?
Mm-hmm. I had a footnote that says it could have been an age or a stature thing.
Oh, a stature. That's interesting. Okay. I hadn't read anything about being younger or less in stature. That's interesting. Okay. All right, that could be. Could be James was the youngest of them all. I don't really know. It was Jesus, then Joseph, Simon, and Judas. And again, I don't know how many of those would have been Jesus' full brothers, and if indeed Mary remarried Alphaeus, how many of those were stepbrothers? I don't know. James.
I think that expression was often used, we see it more as the great versus the less, but I think that was older or younger.
Older or younger?
Or higher in some status.
Okay.
Compared to the great.
Yeah. Everything I read about James the Less, there was no scripture attached to it. And the only, I didn't read anything about being younger or stature or anything like that, but that doesn't mean anything. So that's interesting. That's interesting. I'll see if I can find out any more information about the less reference, and if anybody else is referenced as the less. It's kind of interesting. All right, any other thoughts here? Yeah, I just wanted to kind of throw this out there because I was thinking about that after Sunday, because I was talking about Jesus, the Lord's brother, and then we were talking about the two Jameses in the grouping of the apostles, and I'm like, why did I think that? And I remembered that I had put all these notes together back in college because I thought, maybe James, the son of Alphaeus, and James, the Lord's brother, were the same person. But again, that's just the scriptures don't specify that. That's just a thought. All right? Anything else through that particular point? the 13 apostles, okay, total there were 14, all right, if you include Judas Iscariot, which we're not. So the 13 total apostles would have been the 12 after Matthias was appointed, and then Paul as well. So you've got Simon Peter, Andrew, who's the brother of Peter, James and John, who are the sons of Zebedee, also known as the sons of thunder by Jesus, Matthew, Thomas, Philip, Bartholomew, James, the son of Alphaeus, who also may have been James, the son of Bless, who also may have been James, the brother of Jesus. And then we refer to him as Thaddeus, but his name was Lebbaeus. You start going through the song, and if you throw Lebbaeus in there, I wonder how many people are going to understand what you're talking about. But we know him as Thaddeus, probably because it's an easier name to associate with. And then Simon the Canaanite, who's also known as Simon the Zealot. He's referred to Simon the Canaanite in Matthew 10 and Mark chapter 3, as the Zealot in Luke chapter 6 and Acts chapter 1. And again, references were split as to, obviously this is the same person, but they were split as to whether or not he was a Canaanite who was also zealous, or if he was referred to as the Canaanite because the root form of that, and then the root form of that being meaning zeal. And if that's why there's the difference. But either way, it's the same person. And then, of course, Matthias and Paul. All right. Any questions or thoughts for the apostles? All right. Now, we want to talk about the Great Revolt. So, the Great Revolt started in 66-ish. Keep in mind that in 66, Nero was the emperor at that time. And he had already presumably, at or around this time, and possibly even as a result of the beginning of the war, this is when Peter and Paul were put to death. Okay, thereabouts, either right before or right after the start. So, and this is an article from Ancient History Encyclopedia I thought was kind of interesting. Roman Empire, we're not going to talk about Roman Empire. Perfectly balanced between a mixture of hard, I don't care about that. There we go. Palestine had long been Hellenized, it's Greek-speaking, since 312 BC under Seleucus I. Nicator Greek culture flourished. However, under the Hasmonean dynasty, this Hellenization became more than that of Greek culture and the cosmopolitan way of life. Romanization of the Jewish Hellenized classes came, I have no idea what that word means, of corruption that had previously flared under Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, Antiochus Epiphanes, incidentally, back in the 200s BC, there was another rebellion, although it wasn't specifically Rome. But the Jews had a for whatever, there was constantly, they were being conquered and occupied, and so there was constantly revolts against being occupied. Antiochus Epiphanes was the one that defiled the temple before the Roman Empire came to power. So then the local Greeks, Hellenized Jewish elite, supported the Romans, and as such, and when you read the local Greeks, Hellenized Jewish elite, a lot of those very likely would have been Sadducees. Okay, the reason why they were elite was because they were the wealthiest of the Jews. Not to say all of them were, but many of them were. They supported the Romans and enjoyed the finer things that the Romans could deliver. The Jewish elite became more aware of their higher place in society, did whatever they could to keep the status quo. The Sadducees, the elite of which the Romans favored, had the majority of the Sanhedrin and defended Herod, the client king of Rome. Not all Jewish people supported the Herodian stance. The Pharisees, who we know who the Pharisees are. There was also the Zealots and the Essenes. There's some talked about the Pharisees having merged with the Zealots around this time in fighting back against Rome, were deeply opposed to it, were incensed by the inroads that Hellenism continued to make into the Jewish religion. The Romans had unintentionally nurtured a class divide in the Jewish religion that was created under the reign of the Seleucids. So this talks about the corruption that was involved, the taxes that was involved. That taxes was a huge issue as well. Josephus, most of us are familiar with Josephus, who was a Jewish historian. He fought alongside the Jewish people in the revolt, but he records the sheer ineptitude of the Roman governors of the province was the main cause of Jewish anger. The indifference and malice from the Judean governors reflected the malice of the emperors in Rome. When Pontius Pilate was elected by the Senate to take the reins of the procurator of Jerusalem in 27 CE or AD, the relations of the common Jewish man and the Roman people were in tatters. Pilate shared the same disdain for the Jewish people as Emperor Tiberius and quickly began to bring about a new kind of cult to replace the Jewish religion in the area. I hadn't heard that before about Pilate before I read this article. I would suggest that perhaps later in his reign, Pilate was a little bit more patient with the Jews' beliefs, primarily because of the evidence we see regarding Passover. Okay, at Passover, he would let someone go. He didn't have to do that. That wasn't something that was required by law, but he did that to show respect for the customs. And so I tend to think that he may have started out that way, but I don't think he remained necessarily had disdain for all the Jews. I don't know that that's the case the whole time. In 64 CE AD, Florus presided over Judea. He had the same indifference. This is different than Felix and Festus. This is another F, Florus. And alphabetically, he would also become next. Okay, very good. He had the same indifference to the Jewish populace as Pilate, but did not have the political intellect to calm the tense Jewish society when things turned sour. In other words, as Josephus states, Florus was incompetent. So the class divide, the unbridled disdain for the Jewish people, it brought about a riot in Caesarea. That's where the beginning started. In fact, it started with there were merchants making sacrifices or something like that in front of one of the temples in Caesarea. Not a Jewish temple, but a Greek temple. There, the Zealots, a band of unhellenized and anti-elite Jews, wiped out the Roman-backed elite Greeks that had inhabited the area. Florus, Gessius Florus, in a rage of scorned hubris, plundered the holy temple to fund the cult of Caesar and erected statues of Emperor Nero and himself with the money he took. This would have been the temple in Jerusalem that he raided. This obviously enraged the Jewish people. The temple was not only the center of religious and social life for the Jewish people, but it was a sign of God's presence in the holy city. Again, that being from a Jewish perspective. When Florus raided the temple and ordered the residents nearby to follow his form of polytheism around it, it was the biggest insult to the Jewish religion. The Jewish people rebelled. Random attacks on Roman citizens followed throughout Judea, particularly in the northern towns. There, in areas such as Narbata, the Jewish people overthrew the Roman government. As you see how all this kind of the powder keg was Caesarea. But remember how when we talked about in Acts chapters 22 and 23, especially when Paul ends up being sent to Caesarea before Felix, and remember the assassination plan or plot to kill Paul, especially not only then, because that certainly would have included killing some Roman soldiers who were protecting him. Okay, so that would have been, and plus Paul was a Roman citizen. So that certainly could have instigated the revolt early. But then especially when Paul, the request to Felix to bring Paul back to Jerusalem. And with all the guards that would have been coming back with Paul, they would have had to kill those guards to get to Paul in Acts chapter 24. And that very possibly could have ignited everything a couple of years early. Nolan?
There was a reference a paragraph back to the cult of Caesar. Was
Yeah.
that something coming from the seat of Caesar or was this just a local attempt trying to...
I think this was a local attempt. I haven't read anything beyond the local Judean area, or specifically with Florus, about the cult of Caesar. I mean, certainly there were people who, certain Caesars sought to be worshipped as a god. Okay, that certainly was the case. And Nero certainly was crazy enough to accept that worship. But I haven't read anything about a cult of Nero that was or a cult of Caesar that was widespread throughout the Roman Empire. I tend to think this was a political use of that attempt to make Caesar, or maybe particularly Nero, the center of some kind of worship to fight back against, in this case, the Jews. That would be my thought process. I'll see if I can find out anything else about the cult of Caesar, but as far as I know, this was a local type thing. All right. Anything so far through these couple of paragraphs? It's kind of setting up what the political landscape was. And I apologize in advance for having to read some of this stuff, but a lot of what we go through is going to be basically text of history, of information that I'm not going to be able to memorize. And it would be a lot faster and a lot easier just to present it as opposed to figuring out a way to, and I will summarize some of it, but any thoughts through what we've already read? All right, in response to the Jewish victory, the Roman legion in Syria, backed by the neighboring Scythica, attempted to quell the Jewish rebellion. Syrian Romans took large areas of north of Judea. Galilee revolted without much effort. The Romans spread themselves too thin. They were ambushed, defeated on the coast of Judea at the Battle of Ben Horon. This was a huge victory for the rebels. Emperor Nero, angry at the impudence of the Jewish rebels, sent the Roman military general Vespasian. Eventually, he would become emperor himself to destroy the rebel armies and punish the citizens in the Judean province. Vespasian and his son Titus returned stronger to Judea with more men and slaughtered nearly every Jewish rioter in Caesarea and northern Galilee. Around 10,000 Jewish people were either killed or sold into slavery. The remaining Jewish rioters fled Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the Jewish people stopped paying taxes in the temple and indiscriminately murdered Roman soldiers that were stationed there. During this time, they overthrew, remember Antonia, the steps of Antonia that Paul offered up his speech to the people in Acts chapter 21, chapter 22. And then that fort, I guess you could say, that garrison that existed there where the Romans stayed, that was overthrown. We're going to get into that. The Zealots and the Sicarii overran the Roman military garrison from Jerusalem. This was a heartening victory by the year 67. So keep in mind, this is months and years taking place from 66. Now here's 67. This is about a year or so. The year 67, the Romans under Vespasian, so between 66 and 67, Nero died. Vespasian is still general because Nero doesn't die until 69. So 67, the Romans under Vespasian and Titus had taken back all of Judea, killed the Jewish rebels that were left. The Jewish strongholds of Jotapatha, after a 47-day siege, was now under Roman control. They were on the march to Jerusalem. Let's see. All right. Perspective, the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem, mainly Sadducee Jerusalemites, had shifted dramatically from elation to panic. They knew that the revolt would not be a success for long, and they implored the Zealots to surrender peacefully in order to save as many Jewish lives as possible. The Zealots refused. They anticipated the insurrection that would have doubtless come if more moderate Jewish leaders were listened to by the common person. As a result, the Zealots and the fanatical Sicarii publicly executed them and hung their dead bodies so that everyone could see the repercussions of preaching insurgent messages of peace. The moderate leaders in Jerusalem at the start of the revolution in 66 had all been killed by 68, and not one by the hands of the Roman aggressors. Shortly before the siege of Jerusalem, a civil war broke out in Rome. Vespasian became the new emperor in 69, and Titus, the second in command in the war, took up the reins. The Romans were at the gates of Jerusalem in 70 CE, 70 AD, besieging the walls. So we read about the situation in Jerusalem. According to Josephus, nearly 1 million Jewish people from both sexes, including children, signed up to defend the city after the burning of the food. This had disastrous consequences. The city dwellers and the soldiers starved. Those who did not suffer due to malnutrition. Starved. Those who did not suffer due to malnutrition. As the days went by, the Roman army accepted that the only way to reconquer the city was to set up camp just outside the walls. And then in 70, finally after a 7-month range battle, the Romans had damaged the city walls enough to be able to breach them. In the summer of 70, the Roman soldiers penetrated the city. Romans were destroying, burning the city, slaughtering the Jewish people in their wake. The Zealots and the Sicarii retreated to the temple. The Roman legion, after several attempts at breaching the wall, set fire to the temple. The site that once gave thousands of Jewish people hope was destroyed. From a Jewish perspective, God, it seemed, was no longer in the city. This was the most devastating Roman blow to Judea. The rest of the city was plundered and burned to the ground soon after the temple fell. The Romans crushed the remaining beleaguered Jewish resistance. Jerusalem was under complete control of the Romans by September of 70. In all, Josephus claims, over 1 million Jewish people were killed. Jewish people were sold into slavery and many taken back to Rome. 70,000 Jewish slaves built the Roman Colosseum. In Judea, the temple was destroyed and never rebuilt, which instigated a new form of Judaism, rabbinic, or rabbinic Judaism. Rabbis were now the focal point of the religion, taking over from the high priest. Not that rabbis weren't still, teachers before that. We know Jesus was called rabbi, but rabbis became much more central after the destruction of the temple. Synagogue became the center of Jewish life, and with the diaspora, or the spreading of everybody, especially after the destruction of Jerusalem, the Torah became the most invaluable source of knowledge for the Jewish people. So that is something of a overview of the Jewish revolt against Rome. And of course, it ended in 73 technically because the last of the zealots, they took hold of Masada, a fort that was built up on a step that Herod had built, and it was very, very hard to scale. I should have thought to put a picture in there. It's a really impressive place. And as they were being sieged, I think it took like a year and a half to siege Masada, and then they all, instead of surrendering to the Romans or being left to be slaughtered by the Romans, they all committed suicide, and that effectively ended the revolt as of that moment. Okay, so I apologize for the lengthy reading. Any thoughts through the revolt? I feel like, though, going through some of this detail kind of helps us to put into perspective what the Christians were dealing with. Especially when you think about the Jewish Christians and you think about the Hebrew letter being written shortly before the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay, if the letter to the Hebrews was written around 66, 4 years before the destruction of Jerusalem, it gives it great significance to consider the words of the Hebrew writer to Jewish brethren in Judea to understand regarding these Judaizing brethren who are going back to the old law. What are they going back to? When the temple's destroyed, what are they going to have? I mean, the sense of national identity was destroyed in 70. And as for all intents and purposes, that was the end of Israel as we know it. Okay, the new political Israel that exists today, yes, there are many Jews there, but in terms of having the genealogy, the bloodline going back to Abraham, all those lineages were destroyed. And so nobody can trace their lineage back to Abraham. They can assume, they can speculate, but they have no proof that they really are of the blood of Abraham. Individual people. Okay? It also kind of gives us a little bit of political scenery to kind of put into perspective the writings of Paul, the writings of Peter, First Peter primarily, and then 2 Peter. I mean, all of this is going on or building up before 66. Okay, and many of the Christians, they could see it coming. Remember, Jesus, he warned about what was going to happen. And he gave warning to all those disciples in Jerusalem, when you see this and when you see this, and in particular talking about the Roman army, then you'll know the hour has come and, get out. That's the time that you need to get out. All right, any thoughts through this point about the revolt? I thought I had one other little... Yeah. See, in this particular article, the Encyclopedia Britannica, 66 to 70, because that's when Jerusalem was destroyed. I'm trying to find the one that talked about the situation in Caesarea that started it. That's not here. Yeah, all this stuff is the same. The fortress of Masada was not conquered by the Roman general Flavius Silva until April 73. But anyway, one of the articles I read that discussed that the kind of the spark that ignited everything was some kind of sacrifices being offered out in front of some pagan temples in Caesarea, and that caused some kind of response from the Romans, and then that caused a response from the Jews, and then everything went haywire. So, any thoughts through the Jewish revolt? Yes, sir.
It's a terrible judgment that God brought, that Jesus brought upon the nation of Israel for their rejection of the Lord's Messiah.
Yes.
He explains in Matthew 23 and 24 and 25, this is why this is happening.
Right. Absolutely. And of course, God knew what was going to happen. But you remember when Jesus told, he was talking about Jerusalem, woe unto thee, Jerusalem. I would have kept you safe. I would have taken care of you. And he even references cities like Sodom and Gomorrah standing in judgment of Jerusalem. The reference, and how different would our history played out? Of course, God knew it wasn't going to happen, but how different would history played out had the Jews accepted their Messiah the way they should have? And Jesus would have been able to protect his people, or protect Jerusalem and so forth. But obviously that wasn't a part of it. But Jesus says, this is what I could have done for you. But instead, because you have rejected me, this is the judgment that's coming. And you'll note that all of the epistles, save for 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, as well as the Gospel of John, all of them were written before 70 A.D., and in particular, the ones leading up to it. You think about Hebrews, 2 Peter. Now, of course, Peter references the fiery trial which is to try you in 1 Peter chapter 4. That was written back between somewhere around 60-ish, 58 to 64. That's a wide range estimate. But 2 Peter being written, especially also dealing with coming persecution, dealing with scoffers, dealing with all this, trouble that the saints are going to face and their need to be faithful through it. And then, of course, Jude in 68. So all that kind of has a, when you think about some of the warnings and some of the calls from these writers of the New Testament for the brethren to be faithful, a lot of this is looking forward to this time when certainly Nero he goes wacky from 64 to 66. He just starts going after Christians all over the place. But then even after that, with the destruction of Jerusalem, that's going to have ramifications with Christians also, especially Jewish Christians. All right? So any thoughts so far through Jerusalem and Masada being destroyed? Yes, sir.
I just, again, going back to this thought of the phrase was the cult of the Caesars,
Cult of Caesar or cult of Nero? Yeah.
That jumped out at me one time in a study on the Gospel of Mark. That book begins the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. That term gospel, the teacher focused on, was a term that the Caesars used, when they would pronounce about themselves. So it was a common term that the Caesars in particular would send out, proclamation of the world, something about themselves.
Yeah.
And here is this recording of the gospel, the good news of
The proclamation.
the good news of Jesus not in the face of, but as all this is going around, you're setting that scene for us, that political setting. Here's the real good news coming forth about the Son of God.
And someone who truly is worthy to be worshipped, especially. Yeah, absolutely. All right. So before we talk about Timothy and Titus here in just a minute, and again, somehow I'm going to figure out a way to kind of condense all this stuff for notes purposes. That's why we don't have notes out there yet. I'm still trying to figure out how to piece it all together where it's easy to read and kind of easy to overview. So I apologize the notes aren't out yet, but all this information is applicable. It's just kind of different parts of the picture here. So we have Tiberius is probably the one Caesar we're most familiar with. We think about Augustus and Tiberius, both of them. Of course, Jesus was born during Augustus's reign, during the reign of Tiberius. He's mentioned also in the New Testament. Caligula, he was one that was extremely, well, they were all immoral, but Caligula kind of took it another level. But he was not a very good guy. Then we had Claudius. and then Nero. And you'll notice on some of these, their reigns were not very long. Like Caligula was only there for 3 years, and he was assassinated. A lot of these guys were assassinated, actually. Then we had Claudius, who was in power for about 14 years. And then, of course, Nero, starting in 54, and he was there for about 14 years. So this is, he dies in 68, and he died, he died by assassination as well. Nero did. Remember that article talked about the civil war in Rome. It was an uprising taking place, a political issue that was going on, and so Nero was killed. After Nero was killed, we have a man by the name of Galba. He seized power after, Nero's suicide. It was suicide from the uprising. That's right. He seized power after Nero's suicide with support of Spanish legions. He reigned not even a year, more like half a year, 6 months. And then Otho came in. He reigned for 3 months. Vitellius came in. He reigned for 8 months. That's why the article just skips to Vespasian, because Vespasian takes over. He was the general who kind of led most against the rebellion of the Jewish rebellion. He reigned for about 10 years. And then his son Titus takes over. Remember, Titus was the one that took over as general against the Jews. He reigned for about 2 years. Then Domitian took over from Titus, who they were brothers, and Domitian reigned until 96 AD. So Domitian would have been between Domitian and the next guy, and I didn't include him because he reigned until, Nerva. Nerva reigned for a year until, 98? There was another one, but he then reigned till like 117 AD, and I forget his name. But Domitia and Nerva, they would have been Caesars during the time of the Apostle John. So the letters of 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, the Gospel of John, and Revelation would have all been written most likely during the reign of Domitian. Okay. That's the Roman Caesars. Timothy, where are you, Timothy? Wait a minute, Trajan. There was something about Trajan too. Hold on a second. Okay, so Trajan was the one that took over after Nerva. So this is the one right around between 68 and 100 AD. I wanted to mention this. Emperor Nerva was an old man when he came to power in 96, following the death of the tyrannical Domitian at the hands of an assassin. Believing in the Republic, Nerva vowed never to assassinate a senator, and he kept his word. He reduced taxes, brought exiles home, ended persecution of Jews, and generally boosted Roman morale by his mild behavior. On October 27, 97, he adopted Trajan as his son, making him emperor apparent. Trajan, absent with his army, is said to have been unaware the adoption ceremony was taking place in Rome at the Temple of Jupiter. Nerva died suddenly 3 months later, on this day, January 25th, 98, and Trajan became emperor. When he entered Rome, it was on foot with a show of humility as if he were a private citizen. His first winter as ruler of the far-flung empire he spent not in Rome but in Dacia, completing a military campaign. Historians generally rank Trajan as one of the noblest-minded and effective of the emperors because of his friendliness, his readiness to go unarmed into homes where he might have been killed, his fair treatment of the Senate, and his mildness toward enemies who plotted against him. Nonetheless, he was pleased to have his family members elevated to godhood, loved glory, was proud, and a thorough autocrat. So I kind of thought that was interesting, that right around 97, 98, he becomes emperor, and he's going to reign, like I said, till 117, I think, AD. But it's kind of interesting that on the heels of Domitian and then Nerva, they had a slightly perhaps calmer Caesar emperor in place. So there was a little bit of time perhaps of some quiet before persecution stepped back up later on in the hundreds AD. All right. We'll stop there. We will pick up talking about Titus and Timothy. They weren't apostles, but we'll talk about what we know of their history and how they may have died. And then we'll go forward in our study of the history of the church. Thank you, everybody, for your attention. I apologize for the lecture.